I think last time we talked about open code a little bit, and you had mentioned Lovable last week, perhaps the week before. I ended up swapping a bunch of what I was doing in Bolt to Lovable finally. And in Lovable, I've been playing around with trying to create maybe like a generic chat interface. This seems to be something that a lot of people might want. Perhaps externally, they would want to be able to use internal tools, or maybe internally point at something like Llama or what have you. But basically, if you're setting up a chat app in an enterprise organization, what would that look like if you want to pick from multiple models? Now, in my mind, you're probably one of probably three camps if you're using cloud services, maybe Google, maybe AWS, maybe Azure, probably one of those three. All three of them do have what I was looking for externally, which is basically a marketplace kind of for models. So if I want to use something from, let's say, OpenAI, or maybe I want to use something open source like Llama from Meta, or perhaps I wanted to use something from Anthropic. Now, in those three marketplaces, your choices are pretty vast, honestly, but they might be limited by dependencies or maybe agreements between companies. So, for example, getting an Anthropic model on Azure might be a little bit difficult, or getting a ChatGPT or GPT-5 on AWS might be difficult. And therein lies the trouble. So I guess what I was looking for is a way that I could test out multiple models together as new ones are released, as well as maybe plugging them into an orchestration or a routing layer. And where I landed was OpenRouter. We've talked about it before. I talked a bit about it in Open Code, and I've used it for a couple of the apps. One thing that really blew my mind recently, though, was different ways you could use it. So I figured I'd give you a quick overview of what OpenRouter is, because I thought I knew and I didn't actually know. And then we'll talk a little bit about ways that I use it, because I had a bunch of assumptions that were somewhat correct, but often just a little bit wrong, or maybe I needed to head to the docs a bit just to figure out what it was doing.
Okay.
This is what it looks like. Have you heard about OpenRouter before? I feel
Yeah.
like it's somewhat popular. Okay.
Yeah, we've definitely talked about it on a previous episode. I can't recall what exactly we went into. I've personally looked into it, but I haven't created my own account. It does look like it has a lot of really neat things. So I'm curious to see what you're going to show us.
Absolutely. So they will say it's the unified interface for LLMs, but I think at this point in time, what we're getting into is more of a, let's call it like an orchestration, or maybe to use their terms, like a routing era. So in a case where you've got like multiple models, some that are smaller, some that are bigger, and you're trying to figure out what message should go where, this can be handy. Or the other thing would be perhaps if you've got some messages that might come in as multimodal. So let's say someone sends you an image and you want to describe it. That may be a different model than you use for something for, let's say, text to speech. So when you're entering in text and you're getting back speech, and that'll depend on the model that you use. But also, if you didn't want to do that, if you want to actually make sure that you send to the model that you want for each one, you could select that. Now, we talked a little bit about pricing and things like that before, but what I'm going to quickly do is, instead of clicking on any of the trending here, I'm just going to go quickly into the rankings. So what we're going to do is look at the current rankings. Now, this is a big chart, and this is maybe where I heard of OpenRouter first. Is what is OpenRouter currently using? How quickly did something get to the top of this chart? There are a few sites that will give you this information, but as OpenRouter is actually quite popular, it looks like this traffic is significant in terms of letting you know, one, uptake of newer models, and two, letting you know like how used or how much utilization are older models getting. So for example, Sonnet 4, I think it's my favorite at present. I think it's probably yours as well, because it's what runs most of Cloud Code, if not all. And as a result, it's the one that a lot of people will reach for. And you can see here, it seems to be double or more than double the next best, which is 2.5 Flash. Now, 2.5 Flash is one of those smaller models that we were talking about earlier, that you can get a lot of tokens per second, but maybe not the best in terms of reasoning. And sometimes you might want to mix and match some of these models in there, which is hard when you're looking at something from Anthropic as well as something from Google. That it's hard to get both of those models on one of those platforms that we were talking about before. Now, there are a bunch in here. We could graph these over time. We could look at market share. We could see like what changes over time, what categories, to calling, that kind of stuff. But these are important. As we go into here, we click on one of them, you'll see that a lot of these will just give you the model that you can use. And I can just copy this in my clipboard, and I'll show some code samples in a second. But also there's some of those in here that have free versions. I'm going to talk about that in a moment as well. So there's this DeepSeek here. There's also DeepSeek free that you could use. And depending on the key that you've got, it might be that you could use one or the other, or you might need to go into a little bit of configuration. So what I'm going to do here just for a moment is going into docs. We're going to show you some sample code. So what I like about DeepSeek is you can actually go through the sample code, and they'll give you little samples in terms of what you need to build. So for example, If we were looking at Python, this is pretty straightforward. So you create a client using the OpenAI SDK, and then using that client, you can use completions. Now, I'm saying this because the OpenAI SDK is quite prevalent. It's fairly widely used. But if you want to use the OpenRouter API directly, what you can do is actually hit their website and use it that way. So I'll show off a shell example here in a minute, just to show you like what you can do to get started. It's very simple. There is going to be a key in here, but caveat emptor, I'll remove this key after the recording sign. Feel free to try and use it if you want, but that's the reason why the key is there. So we'll quickly go into this code. So this is especially the sample code that they've got on the site. Now, if we go into our shell script, so it's just test.sh, and you can see the script is very simple. So all it does is run a curl to the OpenRouter API. It goes for completions. And using this model here, we can actually make a request using this model to get completion. And then if we run it as a sample, I think we can just believe it's executable. We can run test.sh. And I'm going to pipe this to JQ just because it will spit back JSON, but the JSON will just fill up the page and it's hard to read. You can see a sample above. And then once we've done that, I'll talk a little bit about how you can whittle that down a bit. So the JSON will have many parameters in here. You can see here that most of what we want is within choices. So what we're going to do is look at that. So we could get the ID, provider, et cetera, et cetera. What we probably want are just the choices. So dot would mean everything in JSON notation. And we're going to grab choices and we'll grab everything under there. So all we're going to do is just grab that choices area. Now, this isn't so important if you're writing your own code. I think this is fairly easy to handle for marshalling or deserializing the JSON that you get back. It's not that difficult to do in Python, a little bit more difficult in Bash. So JQ might be a little trickier. So all this did again is just give us back our message, and we're looking for the meaning of life. So of course it takes a minute to answer, but you'll notice this is definitely capable of giving you this answer. Now, that's our sample code. You can write this in Python as well. There's a JavaScript example too, but what I thought was maybe even more interesting when using OpenRouter, other than just plugging into an app or plugging into OpenCode or plugging into some other GUI or UI that you've got. I think we talked about Aider, for example, and Goose. Both of those can use OpenAI, but there's actually a request builder, which I thought was pretty fantastic. So you can go through here and actually pick different models if you want to. So for example, if you want to use Flash Image Preview, it's free from Google, you can do that. And here you'll use your AI key. So assuming that it's got an environmental variable, but you can actually go through and enter system messages too. You are a helpful assistant is generally what most of these are, but you could actually say you are an unhelpful assistant and use it that way. And then actually have an answer. So you can actually change your system prompt as you're going. And this is pretty interesting because as you're starting to create apps, that system prompt is going to be more and more important. Now, it's not really something that is, it's not like a trade secret or anything like that. There's a bunch of system prompts out there that you can grab. In fact, for a bunch of applications or IDEs that you're already using, you may be able to find system prompts there that you can use. So on the ID and the system prompt, you can put them both in to get at maybe an interaction that's similar for a one-shot request. So if you're sending through a one-shot with the system prompt and then your question, you'll get something back similar to the tools you're using. I think a lot of those advanced tools that you and I are using, though, have context, which this doesn't handle, but we'll talk about context. So maybe in another episode in terms of how to handle it. Okay. So the only other thing in here is streaming. So I think in terms of your utilization with models, you probably realized that a couple of years ago when you type in a question, it would take a while and then spit out the whole answer. These days, I feel like most APIs are actually moving more towards a streaming API. So when you create the request, it will echo back your request and then say thinking or something like that, like blank or have some cool gradient on it. And then we'll start giving you the request line by line, sometimes word by word, or maybe even token by token. So it streams in as it's going. It's not important, but it's one of those nice UI elements. It kind of lets you know that something's happening visually as opposed to just sitting there on that spinner, a little ping or ming or a little GIF that you've got that's rotating as you're waiting for it. So essentially, this is the way that you can turn that on. Now, another thing that I noticed when playing with this is we're going to go into my key section here. I'm not going to show any of my keys, but I'll talk about how I'm using them. So when we were doing that test earlier, I was using this test paid key. And you can see that as I was running through the test prior to this, I think I spent about 7 cents. And I believe during that time, all I had done is ask what's the meaning of life, maybe 10 times. So let's assume that it's not very expensive, but it is going to cost fractions of a cent and a pretty large fraction. So not a cent, but pretty high in terms of cost. This will depend on the model that you've got. Now, when we were looking through here, there were a few that said free. Again, I'm going to create a test key. We'll get rid of it in a moment. I'll show you how I'm doing that. So let's say that I want to do like lovable free in here. Let's see if I could type. There we go. And all I did for the free is set this to 0. So it'll mean that it won't use any models that will actually have a cost associated with them, which could cause problems. So if you're routing, you need to make sure that when you receive that, you couldn't use this, go on to something else. This may be a strategy, for example, for a tier of free users, if you want it. People who are okay with sending a call again, or maybe in your UI, you make it easier to resend a call, or perhaps you handle those resends very easily. Now, in the advanced settings, there are a few things in here. Bring your own key in the limit, for example. So if somebody brought their own key into this to be part of that limit, that could work for sure. So for example, if you've added in keys from other providers into OpenRouter, that could be handy. But I think what was interesting to me is under training, logging, and privacy, this is pretty important because I think a lot of people will say there's no such thing as a free lunch. And these days when it's free, chances are they're training a model on it. And in fact, that is the case here, but there's a few other things that you can do that I thought were interesting. So the first one is, hey, allow paid endpoints that may train on input. So you're paying for, let's say, Llama 3, and there are many different providers that will have different costs. Some of those providers may train on your inputs as a result of the lower cost. Some of them may not, but might have a higher cost. Some of them might be free, but they're training on your data. So it will depend on what you're doing. So I've turned on a few of these here. And again, the caveat is assume that you've told your users that what they're putting in is going to be trained on by a third party. That third party could be OpenRouter or somebody else is hosting it. So you can see here, it would limit the kind of usage, but for testing an application, this to me has been fantastic, actually, being able to set like a free key and then run through the app. And once I'm ready, then we'll be over to something that's paid. So you might get faster tokens per second, or time to first token might be faster as well. But as a result, you're paying more. So you pay for that speed or that latency. All right. Same thing, free endpoints that may train on inputs, free endpoints that may publish your prompts. So I think this is something that happened to Grok, for example, recently, or enable input output logging for all requests. So if you do this, you'll get a 1% discount on all LLMs. Great. But also they're going to be logging on everything. So again, if this is something that you're using on your own, totally fine. If you've got clients using it, you want to let them know. Now, at the end here, these ZDR or ZDR, if you're Canadian, endpoints only, would mean that they won't retain any data, but they might be the top tier in terms of cost. So the ones that you're using may actually be not cheap, but as a result, you can tell your clients, hey, the providers that we're using are telling us that there's 0 data retention, and that's our policy. So again, perhaps you've got a different tier here that would use just as ZDR endpoints. And then at the very end, I turned off analytics just because I don't need it. Maybe you turn this off, turn this on. So for me, I thought this was pretty interesting. Now to note, this seems to be an account level setting, not a per key setting. So it might be that you need 2 different OpenRouter accounts in order to do this. Now, what does this look like in practice? So I'm going to show you this. I'm not going to say it's a great app. I've talked about it a few times here. So this app is essentially, it's just a chat app. So what it'll do is allow you to do things like, what is the meaning of life? But the key here is that we can actually go and without an API key, it's probably going to fail because I've been playing with it before, but without an API key, we can go up and use one of the free models. And if I click on these, I've sorted a bunch of them by free, not free. I happen to know that Gemini 2 free should work, but if we do this here, let's see, again, it might fail just because, yeah, I didn't set up the keys. So what I'm going to do just quickly, my apologies, is grab a key again. I'll just grab this. And we're going to remove it, but we'll put up that key here. And of course, I've paid for Lovable at this point in time. Jason, I'm not sure if you've gone through the security review here, but the security errors are in fact real. It's because I'm storing a key in my code, which you should not do. But if we did something like, what is the meaning of, it should then go through and actually work. Now, it might not work, but the fact that it's taking a little minute tells me that it is. I don't know. Yeah, okay. So I've broken my app. Imagine it came back with an amazing meaning of life. So all this to say that OpenRouter essentially has a few different things that you can do for using models. One of the things that I thought was pretty interesting is it can be difficult to know what a model does by the description that's out there. I actually thought this directory of models was pretty handy in terms of telling me what it did. The other was other than just playing around with what we were doing in terms of setting up like those curl commands or little bash scripts or things like that, is actually to go through and start testing using their API to figure out the way that they're using a chat app, but also being able to test models in essentially not free, but in a rather affordable way is pretty interesting as well. So one is finding out what models are out there. Two, finding out what their rankings are is pretty handy. And then three, testing those models for different use cases and comparing them. And then the fourth would be actually taking those models and putting them in your code or adding this routing, let's say tactic or strategy into your code. So you can route between different free ones or different ones that have multimodal or multi-model in some cases, a mixture of experts to figure out which one fits your use case. So that's the long and the short of OpenRouter. So it's a pretty big marketplace for models. People will host them from all over the place. They could be free. There might be caveats about the way that they use the data that you're sending through or how you're logging them on the platform. But in terms of testing keys, for one thing, just to see if your app works, or setting up free keys so that if you lose a key, it's essentially just a denial of access attack so that they could reuse your key so that you wouldn't be able to use free keys. So if you lose it, it's not the end of the world. The last is if you do happen to, I don't know how I know this, just let me know. I don't know how they know, but if you maybe push your key to GitHub, for example, not saying that I did, they'll let you know pretty quickly and you can go in and deactivate it, which is pretty handy. So I would say for especially in the early days of development where you're still trying to figure out what the routing, which model or which level you should be using, OpenRouter seems to be really well poised to help in this regard. Now, again, there are three other marketplaces you can use. Google, Amazon, and in Azure as well will have different ways that you can do this. And there's also Hugging Face out there as well, which is very similar to this in terms of the ways that you can use it, giving you a model leaderboard as well. But it seems to me that this free tier, I don't know what you call it, it's not hack, but this free tier approach seems to help me very well, especially when in level lower rates.
Okay. Yeah, sounds great. Very useful. A lot of flexibility. Like you mentioned, just try all the models and understand their use cases a little bit better. Where we are, I think this it gives us a larger palette to explore to really make sure we are addressing that and not just slapping AI on it just because we can, but it's actually using the right models in the right context, in the right situations at the right cost. And you can figure a lot of that out ahead of time, which I think reduces a lot of the questions about what are we doing? What are we building? So yeah, this is great.
Exactly. Yeah, I think between the both of us, we probably reached for Sonnet 4 for a lot of things just because that's what we're using. But I quickly get confused when it comes to translation, for example, or image to text or text to image, or when speech is involved, or these days as videos as well. Those are areas where I just haven't done a lot of testing because I'm primarily interested in the coding models, but there are many more out there. So yeah, totally agree. There are a few more marketplaces that I want to explore. This one seems to be the most popular, but I feel like Hugging Face is the next step.
Cool. All right, Ryan, as always, thanks for sharing, and we will talk to you at the next one.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Jason.